Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Coming in, grab a seat. I'm so excited because this is my first time in this new room. It's beautiful, and I'm glad that they left the windows when those blinds are up. It's such a gorgeous view, so make sure that you check that out. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our panel, The Beauty of Chaos. I teach creative nonfiction, and this morning I was talking to my students, I think I saw a few of you, about the need to be both specific and universal in an essay. And when I was thinking about topics for this, the beauty of chaos came to me because I thought, wow, that's pretty universal. No matter who you are, certainly life in 2025 feels chaotic. So a special thanks first to President Poser for putting this together, and Dean Badowska for believing in us and giving us space, as well as the incredible Cultural Center team who made the occasion for us today. Thanks always for your support on everything. I'm delighted to be here. Do we need to? Yes, I agree. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm delighted to be here on this stage with these three brilliant women, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say about living with, through, and alongside chaos. We are so lucky to have here with us, first, Dr. Annabelle Haynes, who teaches literature in our English department. Her current research analyzes the confluence of post-colonial development discourse and literary experimentation, with special attention to works by Caribbean women writers. In addition to her academic research and teaching, Dr. Haynes has had an extensive career as an international development consultant. Next is Dr. Katrina Sims from the History Department. Her research interests include 20th century US history, Black studies, women's and gender studies, Southern studies, and the history of healthcare activism in the US. Katrina is also a faculty in residence here on campus, so can really be a great voice to speak to the students for this panel. And finally, Professor Martha McPhee, who teaches creative writing along with me in the English department here. She's the author of the novels An Elegant Woman, Dear Money, and Gorgeous Lie, among others. Multiple lies.
Very important.
Very important distinction there. She is also the author of the recent Omega Farm, a gorgeous memoir, and she was here talking about that just, was that 1 year ago or two?
2.
2 years ago. It feels like yesterday. Her work has been nominated for the National Book Award, and she's been honored with fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. I'm Kelly McMasters. As I said, I teach creative writing, and I direct the publishing studies program here in the English department. I'm both, a writer and a scholar, so I sort of sit in between these folks. So that's why I get to ask the questions. But I am going to sit down for that. But today we will discuss the beauty of chaos, which is, of course, a destabilizing force, and yet often it is beauty that emerges forth from it. Virginia Woolf once wrote that the task of art today is to bring chaos into order. So she's talking about trying to bring chaos into order as opposed to bringing order to chaos. So we're going to talk about both of those movements today. Chaos not just as a negative thing that we get stuck in without agency, which I think today often it can feel like. So perhaps the first thing to do is to discuss what we mean by that. Can we start by defining the kinds of chaos we might want to respond to today? So I'm going to give that over to you while I sit down.
What kind of chaos are we thinking about today?
Yeah.
What kind of chaos aren't we thinking about today?
Yes. It's true.
There's just so much going on. Actually, the writing space is a sanctuary. And I think somebody else, I don't know who said it, but it's similar to the quote from Virginia Woolf that it's making sense, art makes sense of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like that's sort of what I get to do. I'm working on a novel called Contrexeville. It's a love story set before, during, and after World War I, and has a lot to do with French and French in the United States, and also World War I and the American involvement in that. So I've read a lot on French history and also World War I, and it's actually oddly comforting to know in all this research that we've been here before and we're going to be here again and we're going to get through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
When I think about how, the question is, what defines chaos? I go local, right? So immediately, of course, if we think about all the things, we can immediately find ourselves overwhelmed, right? But if I sort of look out into my immediate community, right? So for us here today, we're thinking about Hofstra, Hempstead, also like my familial roots, right? I often describe myself as a Southern transplant, and I woke up this morning with DeMartin Reed on my mind, right? The young 21-year-old who was found, trigger warning, hung near Delta State University in the Mississippi Delta, right? And I'm thinking about the ways in which individuals' lives are constantly threatened, whether it is your ability to procure and maintain stable living, right? Provide for yourselves, right? And in those chaotic spaces, in those moments of being destabilized, what we're witnessing is, to Professor McMasters' point, is opportunities for individuals to share their sort of survival strategies, but also their like organizational efforts and activities, right? It is where our talents really are visible, right, and activated. So I would tell you that in defining what is chaotic, to make it manageable to yourself, to not always be overwhelmed, right? Because it can stymie creativity, it can stunt movement, it can prevent you from jumping in and inserting yourself. Go local, put the blinders on, right? Think about the ways in which your immediate circles are being impacted. And I'm certain that will motivate you to act, because that's where your immediate care and concern can be located.
Thank you both for that, because I've been thinking about chaos a lot lately. And I've been thinking particularly in terms of what I have to offer my students as somebody who is in charge of their learning and development and trying to ethically ground their intellectual development. It can be... Thank you.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Pepper. I've been thinking about what I have as an offering in the experience of chaos to ground my students away from despair and to give them a future. And in my reading Toni Morrison's seminar, we recently read an essay by Toni Morrison called The Future of Time. And Toni Morrison was commenting on the fact that when she was thinking about time in the 90s, she was noticing that there was less and less to offer in terms of a future for young people. And I think that is exponentially true now in 2025. And so in my scholarship, I think a lot about crisis and what that means aesthetically. And in my scholarship, I think about crisis as the truncation of time and the diminishment of space. Now, how do we differentiate between a crisis, which is ongoing and embedded in the systems that we live in, and this idea of what we're experiencing as chaos? Is there a differentiation? And so I sat with that for a little bit, and I thought about the idea that chaos is the magnification of overlapping crises, which are then projected intentionally as spectacle. I'm not sure if we can describe or sit with our experience of chaos without sitting with the spectacle of the projection, the intentional projection of overlapping crises. And that intentionality is what we have to think about every time we need to respond. So what I have been grappling with And to Professor McPhee's point, I think the only solace is art. I've been grappling with the response, because if spectacle is an intentional creation, it is intentionally created to elicit particular types of responses. And those responses might vary from hysteria, numbness, disengagement. How do you distinguish between numbness and, for example, Toni Morrison's directive that to lean into art, particularly in times that feel disorganized and chaotic, we need to lean into stillness. What is the distinction between numbness and stillness? And I'll leave it there.
We're done. Thank you. That was beautiful. To sort of try to metabolize, it sounds like we've talked about creative, community, political, all of these types of chaos. I love that description of the layered crises, because I think what sometimes feels unique, I know to my students, to myself, is that all of that is happening at once. And that is an interesting difference, the magnification, the projection, those words that you were using. Often it just feels like a fire hose. And so how could we have any control within that chaos? And I keep coming back. I find myself returning in the same way that traumatic memory sort of, drives a different line in the brain. I keep coming back to the pandemic years. And that was the most recent time that I think I felt as destabilized as I do in 2025. And yet the coping mechanisms need to be different, right? For our students, for ourselves. And so I think attention, that was definitely one of the thoughts I wanted to bring forward today, in terms of, you each spoke about something specific and individual that you can do. And I think, we'll talk about community in a little bit. But I wanted to ask Martha specifically in Omega Farm, which I talked about in your intro. We start in that book with a layered chaos. And there's this chaos of the pandemic, of course, and then the chaos of your mother's dementia. I think healthcare is something that each of us has talked about individually together off the stage and will likely be part of this discussion. And then being thrown back into your own childhood memories after you return home to your family home. So that is a very specific chaos within the larger scale of everyone's chaos, right? The pandemic. And you were talking about how writing through that chaos, you're building narrative structure out of that swirl. Can you talk to that in terms of how, if, I'm assuming, if controlling the narrative in some way gave you strength, or if this is sort of a chicken and egg question, did you find yourself drawn to doing what you do, doing your work of creating narrative out of real life as a coping mechanism? How did that work for you?
First of all, I'm a novelist, and this is a memoir. And it was, Omega Farm I've written 5 novels, and this is the first memoir. And it came out in a rush. It came out very fast, in 1 month. I've never written anything like that. And so it was very much a part of me, but it was also a surprise. I was astonished, frankly. And so Joan Didion says I write to understand what happens. And I didn't sit down thinking I want to understand what happened. I started this book, and it was supposed to be all about my mother's forest. And in some ways it is, but that it became a sort of really a natural metaphor for the other story, for the other layers that you just discussed. But it wasn't an accident. I knew I wanted to write it. I had written a proposal and I had sold it to my publisher, but I didn't know, it wasn't the book I thought.
Right.
So it sort of took over. But it seems sort of corny, because I don't think this way ordinarily, but it was healing in a way. And it was a profound exercise that I hadn't understood I was doing, but at the end, I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that, but now I understand something, even about myself, or primarily about myself, but things that I hadn't been expecting to understand, because I have 4 sisters, and with this childhood home, a mom who's dying, and there was in the present a ton of chaos, a ton of unsettled stuff from childhood, and all of this happening, and everybody having these just sort of reactions that were psychological and weird and unexplored. And I feel really lucky that this is what I get to do, because I could see through that stuff in the end. I could see what we were doing instead of just hating all my sisters, understanding where the love and hurt was, coming from.
I think that speaks so beautifully to Dr. Haynes' point in terms of, you use the word seeing, that you could see through it, right? And in order to do that, we need to slow down and look at it, right? To the attention idea. And I think part of the chaos by design is that swirl, tornado feeling of you can't stop and be still and look. In my own work, I've written about sort of the haunted house on the hill, this nuclear laboratory that I grew up next to. And the reason it was so scary was because we couldn't see it. And when something is whipping by you so quickly, you can't see it. And often if we, as scholars, right, if we are going to try and understand something, we put it under the microscope. Some people literally. For us, it is, we sit with it and we try and research everything around it, and then look directly at it, right? And yet chaos, why can't we do that?
So I'm of 2 minds. I feel, okay, so I think that there are some communities where the seeing it, right, requires some intention, right? You have to sort of, to your point, Dr. Hayes, stop, have a moment of stillness, reflect, and connect. But for some communities, the chaos is in their face and they're experiencing it in a very visceral way. Of course, I'm thinking about right now the communities that are being over-policed, right? Individuals who are feeling the constant threat, right, to their stability, the ripping apart, right, ripping away from their families. So I'm of 2 minds, right, where there is, for some of us, a requirement that we stop and engage, right? So as a historian, I of course think, oh, but then you need to get rooted, right, in some previous past examples of individuals being still, being thoughtful, being activated, right, engaging in a really thoughtful way, and some people just trying out things to present some solutions to community problems, right? But then there are some individuals where the experience of it is very much sort of ever present. So they are not able, I think, to participate in the same way. So I'm of 2 minds.
Yeah. I mean, I was so excited when you said you would be on this panel, Dr. Sims, because it's hard. It's hard to go with the doctor. I get we've had so many discussions about chaos and about the hunkering down that it sometimes causes, both the damaging isolation and the sort of rolling up your sleeves and get to work type, right? Because that reaction often manifests naturally, especially, right, to Professor McPhee's point, when it's familial, when it's close to home, and you said this too, if it matters to you, it's you're going to put your dukes up immediately. When it's distant, it's a little easier to let it fly by without looking at it. But as a historian, could you give us a little bit of context or long view of times in our past when chaos has certainly destabilized, but also broken new ground for something new, or any people that come to mind? I think often when I feel stuck, I look for models, and either around me or in the past. So does anything come to mind?
So again, I woke up this morning with Trey Reed on my mind, and immediately I thought about Ida B. Wells, right?
Absolutely.
So Ida B. Wells was witnessing the lynching of Black men and women throughout the South. She was determined to gather up as much information as she possibly could, because Walter White had been unsuccessful at that moment with the NAACP bringing charges against these assailants who were taking the lives of Black men and women at a rate of 1 every 3 to 4 days from the 1890s till about 1910s. And she establishes the Memphis Free Press, and she's publishing all this very detailed information. In some instances, the hometown, the age, and the name of these individuals, right? And doing so at real threat to her life. So I immediately think of Ida B. Wells, right? And the ways in which she's capturing this information and she's sharing it. I think about the independent sort of Black news space that's emerging slowly as a result of some of the chaos that's been occurring. So the Joy Reid Substack, and then her independent channel on YouTube, Don Lemon being fired from CNN and appearing on YouTube with a very successful show. I'm also thinking about Roland Martin and his Black Star network, right? And so the ways in which these individuals are tethered to, linked to the community, telling these narratives that are not making their way to MSNBC, CNN, or Fox, right? And as a result, we have, right, fragmented sometimes, but some important narratives that some would argue are peripheral stories, but they matter nonetheless to these communities. So for me, I just think we can all participate. We are witnessing in our individual spaces, right? Some inequity, some discrimination, some unfair issue, right? Whether it's in your lecture hall or it's in your community, your local church. And my question would be to you is, are you participating in maybe gathering the information that can be shared and disseminated? Right? Are you participating by sharing your perspective of what's fair or unfair, or right, what strategies individuals should consider moving forward? I often hear my students, when I talk about Ida B. Wells and how she was kicked off of a train, right? She was beaten several times. Her life was constantly threatened, so much so that when she was in Holly Springs, Mississippi, the local Black community, many of them were not sleeping, taking shifts with shotguns behind their doors, right? Prepared for the local vigilante group to come in and take her because she was investigating a series of lynchings that had occurred in that community. And so I think about would I have been willing to put my life on the line in the same way to sort of gather that information? Perhaps not, right? But I might have, gathered up my nickels, quarters, and dimes to contribute to her effort, right? I might have given up my train ticket to make sure that she could make it to the next stop, right? I might have provided food, right? So I just would ask you again, as Dr. Haynes mentioned, right? What are your talents, and then how are you participating? For me, it's getting rooted in some past experiences, some past examples. And I know that there's like this hopelessness, right, that exists. And I think part of that is because we have done y'all a disservice. I'll say that as a professor. We've made fighting for equality look really easy, right? I mean, we hold up Fannie Lou Hamer, right? We hold up Shirley Chisholm, and ooh, they struggled, but ooh, they overcame, right? And resiliency is not, developing that muscle is not easy, right? And so I think part of what I call myself to do in the classroom is just tell a harder, harsher, truer, more accurate telling of individuals' experiences so that we can be honest about the individuals who are responsible for a lot of our freedoms and liberties.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what strikes me is that you're also thinking about your gifts, and right, I appreciate that we can't all be Ida, right, is what you're saying.
No,
right?
It should.
Right, and we do what we can with what we have.
That's right.
And everybody has some gift.
Yes.
And to know that, whether it's in student government or at the literary magazine, or whatever way that your gift allows you to quiet that noise, right? I imagine everybody here with a blanket, sort of like a wet blanket, kind of just calming the chaos, right? If we all did that at the same time, and that's the community aspect that you're talking about. If we all choose to do that at the same time, we can quiet the storm, and then we can see a little bit more. And I think that idea of, constantly scrolling, and it's so easy to whip it back up, and it's the calming that's the resilience that is so much more difficult. Yeah. Did either of you have other, aside from Tony, because I'll get to Toni Morrison in a moment, but want to respond or have any other folks that they think about?
I just find it, apologies, I find it really interesting and refreshing and helpful in my thinking to go from Professor McPhee's experience with a mother suffering from dementia. I too have a mother suffering from dementia at the moment, if you want to talk about personal chaos. To Professor Sims's framing of grounding, I think you both really articulated really well what I was looking for in terms of how to distinguish between numbness and stillness. And I think the way that I would characterize how both your responses intersect is an alternate activation of the senses. Because I think the spectacle of chaos wants to capture our senses in a particular way. Like my experience of intentionally, mind-numbingly scrolling through TikTok is that of a type of chaotic loss of control, because I can be kicking my feet up and giggling at one video, and one scroll and I'm seeing somebody's head being blown off. That is spectacle, right? The change in that is just that we have our fingers on the pulse, whereas before it would have been your TV news story about a devastating war and it's scrolling at the bottom about some Hollywood divorce. That type of juxtaposition is its own spectacle, and I think that is a capturing of our senses in a way that Professor McPhee's experience of going in a kind of artistic flow is a type of recapturing of the senses away from the chaotic experience. And it's funny that our resident historian went immediately to narrative as well as the reference of the grounding in community, which needs a more immediate experience of the senses. And so I think if I was prepared to only talk about chaos today and not touch on beauty, but I do think that recapturing of the senses through art and artistic practices where perhaps the beauty lies.
That's where it comes in. Yeah.
You know, something else came to mind while you were talking, and you said maybe you couldn't have done what Ida B. Wells did, but you could have contributed some change or a train ticket, et cetera, food. As a writer and as a serious journal keeper, it's a serious business to bear witness and to do so in the private space of your journal. And it is something that everybody can do. You can sort stuff out there. It's a record for later down the road. There was, during the pandemic, there was an interesting article in the Times where they had found the lost diaries of war, and they were, I want to say Amsterdam, but I'm not sure if it was, but they were from World War II, and the Minister of Culture had asked the people of the town, of the city, to keep journals, and they did, and they gave them to the minister later, and they were left in some basement somewhere, and then they came out, and then 5 or 6 years ago, they were rediscovered. And it's fascinating. Some people were excited the Germans were coming, most weren't. But you had this real-time view of what this experience was like from ordinary people like us. And it was, it takes you right back there. It's a contribution.
And also to the point of journaling, as somebody who, as I just confessed, is often consumed with the scrolling, it allows you to know what you think.
Yeah.
Which I think is really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I've left the abyss cesspit that is Twitter because it was just too many people's thoughts, right? And I'm in more the image space, but because we have so many thoughts, so much access to other people's thoughts in the form of spectacle, it's really difficult to know what you think, or even to get time to order your thoughts. So I think because journaling has been relegated to a self-indulgent, especially feminine practice, it's not taken seriously. But I think now more than ever, because of how much access we have to other people's thoughts, journaling is really, really powerful.
Such an important point.
It can be, and has been in the past, revolutionary for exactly that reason. It is bearing witness in a way that is private and closer. It's often what people are most afraid to say out loud. And in terms of the idea of all of these voices and opinions, right? There are so many opinions ready and willing to tell you what to think. And you do have to ground yourself and go to battle knowing solidly, if you have any hope, what you believe. And I agree, for me, we're all coming out as journalers here. That is the space where I figure that out, because there's so much I don't know, and we can only read so much, and it's helpful to at least begin to move in a direction, right? Sometimes we don't even get to a destination, but at least we can know which direction we're leaning in terms of how we feel about something. I do have a question about Toni Morrison. Okay. Which I'm very jealous of any of you who are in the Toni Morrison class. And you're about to go to a conference about her work, right?
I am.
Yes, so lucky. So Morrison is such an incredible study in both her life and her work. And I would like to pick this back up in terms of the journaling. I was recently diving back into Sylvia Plath's journals, and I just love the way that they mix her, just incredible writing power and thinking big thoughts next to being boy crazy, right? Like the domestic grocery lists next to, serious mental health concerns and things like that. And that is closer to our day-to-day. And I think Toni Morrison she is so multifaceted, and most people don't know all of the history, right? How can you? Well, you probably do. But so she, I think, to me, is a really amazing kind of model or totem for, what would Tony do kind of thing, like when I'm wondering what to do. Because she creates such beauty out of chaos, historically, creatively, in every way. And she really is a good example of the artist's task in troubled times, to elevate ground, right? In The Nation, she wrote a really beautiful piece feeling paralyzed when she couldn't write in dark times. And in this piece, she draws a scene about feeling depressed the morning after an election, the fear, the darkness, and just not being able to write. And she was complaining to a friend on the phone. I know you know this. And the friend says, no, this is precisely the time when artists go to work. Not when everything is fine, but in times of dread. That's our job. And she writes, I felt foolish the rest of the morning, especially when I recalled the artists who had done their work in gulags, prison cells, hospital beds, who did their work while hounded, exiled, reviled, pilloried, and those who were executed. With an eye to the various brokenness of the world, past and present, Morrison writes, this is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. I think it's important to note that this piece she's writing, because I imagine lots of us thought of a different election, she's actually writing in response to the 2004 election of George W. Bush. And I think this kind of perspective, right, to Martha's point, Professor McPhee's point, in the piece, in the work that you're building now with that new novel, looking back at the world wars, the idea that that's how Morrison felt in 2004 somehow comforts me, because I immediately thought of a different election. And I wondered, in your research on Morrison, I know you said you were going to talk more chaos than beauty, but is there some kind of way that you saw in her life, a way that she magically was able to conjure this balance in a way that maybe others weren't? How did she do it?
That's a big question. but absolutely, there's so many gems in Toni Morrison's life overall. But before I get to Toni Morrison's life, I always think about her friend chastising her on the phone, saying this is exactly the time artists get to work. There's no room for despair. Maybe a little bit. Maybe despair.
Thank you.
Just for, but put a time limit on despair. I think we need to kind of move through the feeling of it, because I think the impulse to kind of push back on the feelings that are being intentionally summoned from us can lead directly to numbness. But in terms of Toni Morrison's life, to Professor Sims's point, I make it a point to my students that Toni Morrison didn't publish her first novel until she was 39 years old. And so she published her first novel in 1970. And during the 60s, the heights of the civil rights era, her contribution was not that of an Ida B. Wells, right? She wasn't on the front lines. She was a part of the publishing industry. So Toni Morrison, in the industry that she was in, made significant contributions to American literature because of her advocacy and her choice in terms of what would meet the public. She's responsible for the publication of Angela Davis's autobiography, Muhammad Ali's biography, one of the most important archival sources of African American history called the Black Book, and so many others. And so that is what she spent her time at a time where perhaps her work would have been missed as apolitical or disinterested or not invested enough. In retrospect, we have so much history because of what she spent the 70s doing as an editor. And so we think of her as a novelist first, and then as a nonfiction writer, a speaker, but there's a whole part of her life where she was a student, an observer, a mother, and an advocate in the specific way that she could be, which is as an editor, and somebody who could advocate for narratives and other people's voices coming to the fore as opposed to her own.
She was curating content.
In a way.
Not for spectacle.
Right, not for spectacle, yeah. And to that point, we're in my publishing studies capstone, we build a literary magazine every year. And that's one of my favorite conversations to have with the students. Once we go through the very large slush pile that we get from, it's all non-Hofstra work, and some of it is amazing. We always have more than we are able to publish that we want to publish. And some of it is terrible, of course, but we're first thinking about quality.
Mm-hmm.
But then we get to have the very important conversation of whose voices we want to amplify. Mm-hmm. And that, in publishing, certainly has changed, I would say. I was going to say this, but like this. And we can do that on a classroom level together and have those discussions together, right? You don't need to be a powerful editor at a big publishing house in order to have that effect. You can make that choice by what books you purchase, who you're reading, what websites you're looking at. All of that, right, requires not mindlessly scrolling, but having agency and making those decisions and thinking deeply about how you would want to curate your own content that you are constantly consuming in whatever format you're doing that.
I just had a thought about despair because you gave the example of windmill, and I think one of the ways to dislodge yourself from despair, which I think you do have to move through, you can't just ignore, is to think about somebody else, but not somebody else who might be far away, which will spiral you further into despair, but as Professor Sims noted, somebody in your community, in your actual, so kind of really being intentional about thinking about the people in close proximity to you and focusing on them as opposed to your own kind of chaotic feelings is a really practical and material way of moving through despair.
Yeah, caregiving, taking care of other people. I often give this example in my creative writing classes. My mother worked in hospice when I was growing up, and now that has become one of the greatest, what I think was one of the greatest strengths of my childhood, having a mother who could do that work. At the time, and this is where the journal comes in, right? At the time, I would often write how frustrated and annoyed I was because if I had a bad day in high school, right, there's no way it would compare with the day that she just was coming home from work having, right? Those stakes are completely different, and I could never compare. Now, she never tried to compare those things, to be fair, but in my mind, it was, I always had this other imagined person thinking about those layered crises, right? And that is why I love commonplace books and journals, and because you can literally see that from page to page in our everyday existence, how we move through everybody's life, right? The specific and the universal is crisis. That is something every human has in common, and chaos. And it does feel, I think, to your point about the ways that we have this horror, right? Savagery next to beauty, on sort of a very quick screen, it does feel different in 2025 in that way. And yet the response, perhaps historically speaking, we can still look to models who have not been through exactly this, and yet I think it's valuable to look and remind ourselves that others have been through these types of feelings and moments and made it through. I think I have time to ask you one more question before we open it. We're going to welcome questions from the audience in another minute, but I wanted to return to the idea of attention. I have two more questions, but we'll see. that I know I want to ask. This morning I was journaling with some fellow writers, and we looked at a diary entry by Dorothy Wordsworth. Yes, the sister of William, but more than that. Also an author and poet in her own right. And we read a diary entry from 1802, cataloging a walk that she'd taken with her brother in the Lake District. And she goes on and on and on about these rows of daffodils, right? And these knots and rows of daffodils. And 2 years later, William wrote his famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And both are gorgeous examples of what can happen in two different genres when we slow down and give our attention to something, and we stop and really look. This morning I was going out, I've passed my own front yard multiple times every day, and you stop seeing. We have an amazing writer coming in 1 month?
On the 22nd of October.
22nd of October for the Great Writers Series that Professor McPhee runs, Linda Berry. And some of you might be in the Linda Berry class. And her entire practice is about slowing down and seeing. And I think while, that was beautiful to look at in terms of daffodils and see the different way that they were looking at the daffodils. And now, 200 years later, we're still reading these works. I find doing that with people is what we need now. And making sure that as we're walking by, if I'm walking by and my lilac bush right now is very dead, and I just realized this morning, there's one little lilac. It's so purple and bright right in the middle. How? I don't know. And I pay more attention to that lilac bush than I do to my neighbors, I think, sometimes. And I know I want to, in the face of chaos, try to pay more attention in that way, because attention is power. And that is one thing that everybody has, is where to aim your attention. And that doesn't cost anything, right? And I think for me, after this conversation, that's where I want to aim my attention, is remind myself to focus on people. Because we're all individuals in this chaos together. But I wondered if attention, because each of you have mentioned it, if you had anything additional to say about that particular subject versus chaos or beauty.
Well, you said it all. It is all about paying attention. The class I'm teaching for freshmen is about paying attention, using Linda Berry. So I think you said it so well. I think we're trained to think in abstractions, and paying attention allows you to think in concrete images. And what you say about training that on people is very powerful.
So again, I am thinking about you all, right? And how even Professor McMasters, right, in your telling of the lilac, the single lilac that's thriving, and the fact that you were not engaging or had not engaged with your neighbors, I feel like an undercurrent of like self-critique and judgment that I think sometimes stops us from giving things attention, right? Because we are worried about the response, or if our understanding interpretation is accurate, if we will be embraced or pushed away, right? And I know in particular for my students that can be like a real source of like the thing that's fueling the stuckness, right? Or the detachment, or the resistance to sort of jumping in. And so I think we should, of course, be giving one another attention, but then I'm wondering, do we have strategies that we can offer our people, right? As you all do the important work of turning to your neighbor and saying hi, right? Or going out into your community and saying, what do you need? And being confident enough to offer your talent and your resource, right? In a timely way, right? That will be helpful, but also perhaps that won't then result in you being resistant or not sort of continuing that practice if the response is not favorable, or if the person that you're offering this talent to, or this resource to, with whom you're giving your attention, tells you to mind your business. And that what you're offering is insufficient, right? So I'm wondering, can we offer some strategies when we are encouraging our folk to go out and pay attention?
Strategy. The word.
I'm sorry, I'm not the one asking
Well,
questions.
can I say, the word that comes to my mind is curiosity.
Okay.
And so I notice when I'm paying more attention, I become more curious. And it's a lovely, it feeds. And then if you ask a question and somebody doesn't answer, or if they do, and that creates another question. But I think curiosity is a strategy.
I'm thinking about my students, some of you are in the audience, and how different I find their social interactions often. So my strategy is by force.
Okay.
I often force my students to do presentations with each other in community, because I find that they're a bit afraid of each other in a way that I have a lot of empathy for, because I am not native to the technologies that they're native to. And they exist in an attention economy where the stakes are really, really high, because the spotlight, it's either you're in the spotlight for profit, and that's your livelihood, or you're in the spotlight for a different kind of profit, which is a type of shame, weaponized shame that is wielded against them. And so there's a lot of, I think, anxiety around interaction and being attentive to others and engaging in that practice of curiosity, where one question leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, because the types of rejection and intensity of the attention that they experience is different. I think I had to come to terms with that, instead of just being like, y'all don't make eye contact. Why do I know 37 of y'all names and you are coming to me to ask me who you did a presentation with on Google Docs? Right? So I had to really sit down and think about what is happening and have a lot of empathy for that perspective. And so, yes, I think curiosity is a part of it, but I think of course, my strategy is by force in the classroom. You will present with each other, you will form communities as long as you're here, as long as I'm here. But I think maybe another strategy is to, and this is going to be very controversial because I don't mean this at the, I don't mean that we abandon intellectual integrity and rigor, but I also mean to provide low-risk opportunities as well. I mean, I just immediately went to the classroom space because I know that our conversation about attention is going to be very different from my students' generation experience of attention in an attention economy. So that's completely not what I was going to say, but.
No, and I think to that point, the idea of maybe it might feel onerous to build, even that word build community, right? And perhaps to honor the communities we already have. So the classroom itself, because you're simply sitting next to each other, that is a community, right? We are in community here, and I kind of want everyone to turn to their neighbor right now and say hello. Now that you said that, let's try it. Just hi.
Bring back church.
Yeah, right.
To your neighbor.
Yeah, and if no one's next to you, go in front or behind. I see you, try it. Right?
Turn around. Say hi.
Hi, back there.
It
Hi in the booth.
When I asked them to introduce each other, they were just like,
So it's not that hard, right?
Sometimes it is.
It is,
You know,
yes.
sometimes it's like, ugh.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that experiment.
Appreciate it.
But hopefully you realized, oh, maybe you do know the person next to you, or maybe you don't. But the next time you see them, maybe out on College Walk or something like that, and you say, oh, didn't I meet you at that thing last year? And you'll know somebody extra, and that's, we as Hofstra itself is a community, and you just extended yours. So
Can I just say that 2 former students are getting married on October 11th. They invited me to the wedding.
Oh my goodness. That's a different community. That's great. Oh my gosh.
They sat side by side in class and met each other.
See? Oh, you never know. Maybe we'll. We do have a few minutes left if anyone would like to ask a question about beauty, chaos, practical suggestions, curiosity, empathy, Toni Morrison. We talked about a lot of different things today. Or share an experience. Oh, great.
Thanks, everybody, for all your remarks today. That was really great. I'm biased because I'm in the English department, and many of you are my colleagues, and Katrina and I have done events together, so I'll admit. My question is sort of just a prompt to get you to talk more about, first of all, I'll invite you to talk about beauty, since that didn't come up as much, but also Kelly began with the quotation about adding chaos to order, and I don't think I heard very many examples of that, so if you could maybe consider times where it was too orderly and chaos was the beautiful way to make order less boring or something. So that's it.
That is a good question.
I don't know if I have a direct answer to the question, but as usual, Vim, you are on the money in terms of what I've been thinking about. I think it was the Virginia Woolf quote that you started with in terms of bringing chaos into order. And I think it's a beautiful quote for approaching an artistic practice, but I think that we have to be very specific sometimes about juxtaposing order and chaos as opposites. And I think, how do I phrase this? I think, or I know that we also need to be suspicious about what we consider orderly, because our ideas of order are cultivated under practices of domination. And so sometimes one person's version of bringing something into order is to create the exact types of chaos and spectacle that have to come with the naming and othering and the subsequent violence, the pushing to the margins so that the excesses, or those of us deemed excess, will not be seen, or the expulsion of the undesirable. And so we have to be very specific about what our version of order is. And this might be on a political, this might be a little bit more lofty, but I do think it's an individual practice that perhaps we can journal about in terms of what would order look like in my personal life, and how do I take that to the political sphere.
Absolutely. I have nothing to add.
Yeah.
I was thinking when I thought about that quote, I am not an artist, but I have had that experience so often with, I don't consider myself an artist, in mothering. So very often, I will have an order, the way that the day is going to go, and or an idea of how, my children will experience something, and they will, of course, be their own people and take it to a completely different place that was so much more beautiful than I was imagining in isolation and control and thinking about this is what will happen, because I wasn't imagining, it's sort of like a game of marbles when you spark them against each other. I wasn't imagining the possibilities of 3 ecosystems coming together and crashing and creating a whole new universe, right? Because that's so scary, because there's no control. And yet, over and over in my life with my children, I realize that is a lesson that I have sometimes tried to bring to the writing page. And my students talked a lot. I was happy, and you were in the class for this. Some new writers were talking about, I'm forcing them to write drafts by hand, which is not normal for them. It's out of practice. And the messiness of it felt really good to some of them. It was very painful for others. But for some of them, they experienced that it didn't have to be perfect. And that, I think, is what I think about when the beauty of imperfection, when, especially in our culture, often the goal is perfection.
Right.
So on a different, more domestic level.
That's so
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not going to use that because I'm too short, so I'm just going to that'll do it. Yeah, hi. So we talked about beauty chaos, and you mentioned Ida B. Wells and Toni Morrison. And the first person that came to mind was the late, great Lorraine Hansberry and her piece of Raising a Son, which I believe, I read it, we actually read the book out loud as characters when I was in, I believe, my senior year. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts on if beauty and chaos are represented in that book, and if so, how.
It's been a while for me on that one.
Yeah.
It's been a while for me too, but I'm actually teaching that play at the end of this
Oh, you are?
semester, yes. Beauty and chaos in A Raisin in the Sun. That's a very big question. I think it goes back to trying to have, I think your example actually speaks to this. It's a family who has different versions of what their aspirations or their sense of order might be. And those different aspirations come into conflict with each other. And they also come into conflict with the inherent structural crises of the time, which are racism and housing discrimination and what marginalization and what have you. And I think the beauty of entering that text is allowing you to see the way that family systems work in a particular way, which kind of reminds me of what Professor McPhee started with in terms of writing Omega Farms, that you're in it, but the writing of it is also a certain type of reordering of it that is not sensorially overwhelming or not sensorially overwhelming in a way that is not yours. Right? So I think that's what I'd say about A Raisin in the Sun. It kind of allows us to also see that there is a beauty too in stepping away from the designated path or the kind of ambitious path created for you by society. Like, what does it mean to be successful is its own, has been thrown into chaos for your generation in particular, Generation Z. All we had to do, especially if you had African and Caribbean parents, was be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or pharmacist, barely a pharmacist. I mean, that's all you had to do, and everything else is a failure. You could compensate for that failure by getting a PhD, but at least, it was clear. And I think for you guys, it's a lot less clear, right? And so I do think that we are not, we, at every turn, we're failing you in some way because of what we don't know. We don't know what the clear path is, right? Lawyer, doctor, engineer, pharmacist, a quarter, a third of those jobs may be gone, right? But what I can tell you, the only thing I can tell you for sure, and to this young lady's point, and I'm gonna go on a rant about the importance of the humanities, so bear with me. What I can tell you for sure is that all of the people trying to make predictions about the future, who are telling you that to step away from a sustained and attentive interaction with the arts and the humanities, particularly the professors, the pundits who are saying that the age of the long-form text is done, all of those people are doing you a disservice, because that is how you train your attention.
Hallelujah.
The English major has 3 streams.
I think it's hard to top that. Does anyone else have any questions? Then I can't wait to see you in your next English class. Have a beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.